So I'm going to start a little bit by talking about what Indigenous-led research might look like and how that might be different than other forms of research, and then a little bit about some of the research Nunatziavit is doing, very little bit. One of my elders and one of my mentors, Rick Chavoy, and I always joked about holding a conference called Against Leadership, which has never been held, but maybe one day. And that's because there's many different forms of leadership, but the way it's usually talked about is only one way. And that is as a hyper-individualized, usually very masculinist, macho sort of leading the way with your genius brain and your autonomy and paving the way for others behind you, that sort of stuff. It's not characterized by humility or community or that sort of stuff. And there are many, many, many different ways to do Indigenous-led research, more diverse than the groups that exist, because there's diversity within groups as well. But the way that I've been taught and the way that I've been working with Nunatziavit is in much more of what you might call a facilitator role. So instead of a leader, I'm a facilitator, which means I grease the wheels of other people's vehicles, sometimes literally. I try and make platforms for other people's knowledge. I try and bring things together, and I do not try and put my own business first. And so that's why, for instance, this picture doesn't have me in it, and I didn't take it. This is a photo that was taken on Tuesday in Happy Valley Goose Bay. It's the youth from the Labrador Lands and Water Science Camp, which are Inuit and Innu from around Labrador that go there for a bunch of different science lessons. And this particular one was run by Natasha Healy, who's a NCC, Nunavut Community Council beneficiary who works for my lab. And I sent her because this is her territory. I didn't have to go. She's very capable. And she's much closer in age. She's 19. She also runs my lab. I'll talk about that more in a minute. This is her area, and so she's the one who led the research. And what's important there is that these are young researchers. These aren't, people who needed us in particular, but we're there to facilitate the knowledge they already have on the paths they're already on. So what they're doing in this picture is that they're skimming these devices on the surface of the water and looking for plastics, marine microplastics, which you've probably heard about in the news. Plastics are related to decarbonization and oil and gas because they're part of the same pipeline, of course. So if you solve a lot of climate change problems, you usually also solve plastic problems, which is very handy. Except that right now, a lot of oil and gas is dealing with the climate change gap from the switch to renewables by doubling down in plastics, right? So that's such a huge problem. So when I work with Nunatziavit, we work on a bunch of different things in tandem, which I know most groups and different people do, but we don't separate them out as this one's climate, this one's plastics. It's all sort of ecosystem health, human health, Inuit health, and I'll talk about that more in a second. So that's really important. We're specifically an anti-colonial lab, a feminist and anti-colonial lab. There's many different definitions and types of colonialism. There's settler colonialism, extractive colonialism, internal colonialism. But what they have in common is the assumed settler and colonial access to Indigenous lands for settler and colonial goals. And those goals sometimes are benevolent, right? Like wanting to teach people, like at a youth camp, or wanting to do beach cleanups or that sort of stuff, but they still assume access to land. And so that's something our lab tries to be very careful about. So we only go where invited. We stop going when we stop being invited. There's other protocols too that I can talk about, but one of them is that I hire, we're working on samples, if we get invited to a place and we're working on samples from a place, we then hire people from that place to process samples because samples are land, right? So when we get samples from Nunatziavit, we have Nunatziavit beneficiaries working on them. So this is part of what's sometimes called scientific sovereignty. Sovereignty is part of what makes Indigenous groups and working with Indigenous groups different than working with other quote-unquote diversity groups, because, like you say, they're rights holders, not just stakeholders, and sovereignty is one way to talk about that. Also self-determination. There's a cluster of different overlapping but different terms to talk about that relationship, and that needs to also happen in research.